Today we are very, very proud to welcome Alexandra Kennedy, psychotherapist, grief expert, and author. Alexandra is with us today to celebrate the publication of her powerful new book, Honoring Grief, Creating a Space to Let Yourself Heal. This book is a profoundly important one in that none of us are immune to loss. It provides warm guidance and deep inspiration, which work like alchemy, transforming grief and sorrow into renewal and an enhanced experience of life. So please join me in warmly welcoming Alexandra Kennedy.
So it's wonderful to be here, and I have a number of friends, old friends from San Francisco High School here. So it goes way back. So yeah, and then a good friend who joins me on my Hawaii retreats where we swim with dolphins together. Yeah. So thank you for coming. It's always a very.
Check if they can hear you in the back.
Well, I'm not going to be able to. Oh,
Without the
should I
mic?
use the mic?
Do you want, I can put it down for you.
Maybe.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, because my. Yeah. John, I also had my little thing that expands that was in that bag, I think, of the books. You know that thing?
Oh, yeah.
I think it's in the bag I got.
Where's that bag?
She'll know, yeah.
Where's the bag?
She has it. I think it is.
There's a bag in there.
Oh, there you go.
Of course, that in that bag. Oh, that's not mine. But in there should be like a little round apple in that bag with the books. Was it in there? No, okay. Oh, then I missed it.
Not here.
Okay. Whenever people gather honoring grief, it creates sacred space. Because grief is what unites us as human beings and really brings us into our true humanity. In my experience as a psychotherapist, I would say that grief is probably one of the most profound experiences that we go through and one of the most transforming. The amazing thing about grief is that it touches us all. No one is going to live their life without going through losses. And perhaps you're here because of some loss that's hit you in the past year. Could be the death of a loved one, the loss of a relationship, your health, or a job. Or you're worried about a friend or family member who's grieving and you want to have some resources. There may be small losses that have accumulated in the process of living. And sometimes we also begin to feel generational loss, which is not something that's talked about very much in the grief community. But say your grandmother or your great-grandmother went through a miscarriage or a loss that she never grieved. Those losses get passed down through the generations. And sometimes you're called upon to be the person to help heal that. And what they say is when you come into a place where you actually heal that generational grief, and I have some stories about that in my book, The Infinite Thread, they say that you heal 7 generations back and 7 generations forward. So it's a profound experience. So sometimes we don't even know why we're called in to deal with grief, because it could be something that's coming from way down deep. It may not even be an obvious loss. And in my experience, if you can take the time to tune in to where those losses are showing up in your life and turn toward them, then you have an opportunity to heal. There's a tribe in Africa where they have almost daily rituals for dealing with grief because they know how profound the work of healing grief is. That if we don't heal our grief, the losses, we don't know how to fully open to life. So that's why we do the work, is to live fully. So that life itself can move through us and not get blocked because we're having to contract around something that, a loss that we didn't ever feel. We can't be around that or we can't experience that. So it's coming to that place where life itself can begin to move unobstructed through us, and we can be vital and open and present for whatever comes to us. So, and the ungrieved losses really take a toll on our hearts, and they deaden us. They compromise, our connection to our spirituality, our connection to the whole. And when you grieve, you really, you transform your heart, you transform your experience. The thing that happens when you lose a loved one, when you go through some sort of a major loss, you never go back to who you were. That you have changed. And that's something that a lot of my clients have to grapple with for a while, because you never return to who that person was. And so it's really allowing for that grief to work on you, because grief ultimately is a very wise force, and that's something that people often think, well, I'm going to get overwhelmed by grief, or grief is going to take me over, or it's going to be, I'm going to be, flattened by it. Well, actually, if you turn toward it and you go down deep into it, there actually is this experience of grief kind of leading you, taking you through where you need to heal, if you're willing to listen to what it's telling you, which might be listening to your dreams, which might be listening to where the feelings are showing up, listening to your body, watching what kinds of events come up that kind of guide you. And that's often happens that once you get in that process of healing, the events of healing start to show up more and more and more. And before you know it, you're dealing with a huge opening. My work with grief started back in the 70s. I was lucky enough to be living in Santa Cruz when Stephen Levine was first starting his work. I went to his first death and dying retreat. And I meditated with him for close to 2 years before he moved to New Mexico. It was a profound experience to be with him as a teacher and watching him kind of develop his own work with death and dying. And then I found out that my father had cancer, which he didn't really want people to know about, because he was very private and he wanted to die in his own dignity. We found out he had cancer in November, and by February he was dead. And so I had to find a way to kind of move through that grief, not in the way that I had learned with Stephen, interestingly enough, but to kind of find my own resources. And that's how a lot of my kind of work with grief began to unfold. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those strategies that I discovered along the way, which integrated a lot of the work that I had done with Stephen. And then within a year after my father's death, I was doing a lot of writing, because I've always loved writing. And I wrote a book called Losing a Parent, and it happened to end up on a desk at an editor at Harper, who had just lost his mother, so kind of the timing was good. And then I wrote The Infinite Thread, which kind of went one step further in terms of exercises. And I started teaching graduate level classes on death and dying and grieving. I was 12 years at UC Extension, 11 years at ITP, and I've been teaching at JFK for I think 12, 13 years, still teaching there now. And through that process, working with clients, and through that, I really saw the transformative power of grief. So that's what I really work with when I get clients who come to me and they're grieving. Like a person came today and she's 2 years out, the love of her life committed suicide. And she's still really struggling with that. But we created some strategies for a daily way for her to move through that grief step by step by step. And I told her, this event will transform you if you turn toward it and you let it work on you. And she's been kind of floundering for this 2 years, but she said I could see a light go on in her, that finally she's found something that can really kind of help move her through daily dealing with that loss. So over the years, I've really observed that one of the resources people look for when they're grieving is books. The problem is when you're grieving, the energy moves out of your head. It's not a mental process. It drops down into the chest and down into the gut. And so when people pick up a book on grief and there's a whole lot of words on a page, they tend to just kind of blank out. They can't take it in. or if it's a thick book, they just feel overwhelmed, and so they immediately shut off. So my intention in writing this book was to write a book that could be accessible to people who are grieving in a way that there would be more space than words, and I try to distill everything I've taught about grief over all these years into the fewest words that I could find. So that, you can open there's a paragraph rather than a huge amount. And I really invite people as they're reading just to, if they're, kind of turning toward the grief, open it, read a paragraph, close it, just chew on it, take it in slowly, It's not, when you're grieving, it's so easy to get overwhelmed. And I think that if you're going to really access the transformative power of grief, you have to grieve in a way that you don't feel overwhelmed. And so part of that is finding resources that don't overwhelm you, and also having, very small ways to enter that grief that are contained. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So I really designed this book with that format in mind of how can there be a book that gives a lot of information in a distilled form that is not going to overwhelm the reader. So I think that this works in that way. I've gotten that feedback. So the book is basically divided into 4 parts. And the first part, I really go into how grief works, kind of really explaining, how the grief is an organic process. It's much like the tides. It comes in and it goes out. There's an intensity to it, but then all of a sudden it kind of recedes. You kind of go, well, where did that go? There's also, a sense of, it's very slow and it's very deep, which is very different in the culture, which is very fast and wants fast things. Grief is something that works on you over time. It takes time to really integrate, to take that grief in. So the depth of it is where you start to get the transformation of it. You can't stay here, and that's something my father, the reason he had such difficulty when he was dying was that his own mother had lost her other son during the war. And she never went deep enough to really heal that grief. Her whole life she was grieving the loss of that son. But she was always at this level, crying and, doing all this stuff. But she never dove down. And so, that depth is what creates the access to that transformative energy. So grief is also, it's an incredibly organic process. And so much of the time I tell my clients, trust grief. It knows what you need. It will show you what you need to heal. And in fact, people start to see that they get they're shown from within their own psyche what is coming up. A dream will come, or a feeling generates, or there's an event that happens that gives them a clue as to where they need to go. I remember a young man that I was seeing. He came in and he said, I just have the sense that I want to go and I want to roll on rocks, on stones. I really need that. He was in the midst of a lot of grief. And he said, well, there's a beach down the way that they have a lot of pebbles. And I said, well, go for it. The grief is showing you what you need to heal. And so he did. And he came back and he said, this was exactly what I needed. But you get those urges, and if you follow those urges, even though they don't make sense, then that grief can begin to kind of really move in you, begin to transform you, begin to heal. So John Cowper says grief itself is medicine. And in fact, grief it's like a medicinal, kind of process that we go through. It's its own medicine. If, again, we can access it without feeling overwhelmed. What happens when you feel overwhelmed, you tend to shut down, right? So you stop feeling, you stop, kind of allowing for things to kind of move through you. And then the grief just stops. It just gets frozen in the body. The other thing about grief is that there's a kind of a myth that, oh, well, time will heal. Well, in my experience as a psychotherapist, I've had clients come in who went through a loss of, say, a parent 20 years ago. That grief is still as fresh in them as the day that their parent died. And you can't just say that passively, I will get through this. You have to actively grieve. There's a whole process of really turning toward it and actively grieving. So the other thing that I cover in part 1 is how people learn to avoid their grief. Overworking, overstimulation. Alcohol tends to go way up when people are grieving. It's interesting. Alcohol affects people much more when they're grieving. Has much more. The other thing about grief is that it reaches into every aspect of your life. It's one of the few experiences in life that there is nothing that is not touched by the grief. Even your whole body chemistry changes. People who are grieving tend to have a lowered immune system. They catch more colds, they get more flus, that's natural. It's part of the process. Your whole immune system is affected. Your work is affected, your relationships are affected, what you want to do with your life is affected. The questioning that you go through, with grief is a natural part of the creative process of grief. Where am I going to go from here? I've gone through this big loss. So, part 2, and this is going into kind of some of the strategies that I've developed over time for grieving. And I would say that this particular strategy is one of the most potent. I've had clients who have lost children, who were flat on their back, unable to cope with life. Their partner had to bring them in, put them in a chair. And this one strategy has made a difference in terms of being able to re-engage with life. And that's what I call the sanctuary. And part 2 is dedicated to that. The sanctuary is, she was talking about alchemy. The sanctuary is like an alchemical vessel. You guys know what alchemy is? That it's this process of transformation that they talked about. You take the black material, which is like grief, and you put it in this container that is enclosed. You turn up the heat on it. The energy can't go out and the energy can't come in. You turn up the heat and the whole thing transforms. And in The Alchemist, we're looking to transform that black stuff into gold. Well, that's essentially what happens with grief. You put the black stuff in this alchemical vessel, you turn up the heat, and this black stuff that you've associated with everything that you want to avoid actually is transforming, and at the end of it, you end up with gold. Because it changes your life. It changes your whole approach to life and your whole attitude toward life and your willingness to really live fully. So the alchemical vessel is a time, a limited time, and I want to emphasize that you don't, the old idea about grieving is you go in your living room, you close the curtains, and you sit there for 6 weeks, and you just fall apart. That's not the way the psyche is going to heal. So what you do with the sanctuary is you create a small place, in your home that you can go to, and it's set up with, maybe pictures of your loved one or things that remind you of that loved one. And you spend 10 to 20 minutes there each day. So there's a rhythm of going toward the grief, turning toward it, and then letting it go. And that's really important. So after you finish that 10, 20 minutes, you turn away from it, you go have a cup of tea, you call a friend, you could take a walk, you re-enter life. Because grieving is about life. And if you don't include the reintegration of that, the grieving process into life, you're going to miss, the boat. So the sanctuary is that contained place that holds you at a daily level so that you can turn toward the grief and then let it go. Turn toward the grief, go deep enough to heal, and then let it go. And so I have a number of exercises, for example, in this that come in part 3 and part 2 on how to use the sanctuary. Part of it is just going and just closing your eyes and feeling where you're holding the grief in your body. Just showing up for what's here. Where is it today? Am I feeling sad? Am I feeling angry? Am I feeling numb? Am I feeling happy? And meeting yourself just there. Not trying to change yourself, not trying to argue with where the grief is. letting it be just exactly as it is. Now, ultimately, that's what love is, right? Showing up for yourself, that you can accept wherever you are in that moment and you're not trying to change yourself. So basically, you're showing up with love and tenderness and compassion with yourself as you're grieving and just holding that space tenderly and then letting it go and then going back into your life. That, I could tell you story after story after story of people who have come who were overcome with grief after a week. They began to feel this kind of, they had their light in their eyes again, and they started to re-engage with life. Huge, deep griefs actually have shifted with that one strategy. So it's incredibly powerful to dedicate a time and to use that daily. People start to find that when they use it, they find that they can show up for their work, that they can actually concentrate at school. Then when they don't use it, they find that their whole day is completely different, much more jumbled, much more emotions are kind of racing around, that there's kind of a center that they start to access in that sanctuary that makes a huge difference on the days that they use it and the days they don't. So people start to really find that rhythm. Same time about every day is really helpful. And they have that rhythm of just going to meet their grief. At a certain point, many people have said, it's a homecoming. That's where I really feel like I've come home. That's where I can relax. That's where I feel, this sense of peace. And that's what people start to experience, is peace in the midst of the grief. And starting to trust that when you turn toward the grief and you're not overwhelming yourself, actually you start to feel this sense of deep, abiding peace in the midst of that loss. So part 3 is another kind of part of the grieving process that I found to be very important, that again is not really talked about a lot in grief circles. And that's the ongoing interrelationship we have with anyone who has died who we've loved. And that relationship continues to move on after their death. That relationship is still very much in your heart. You never lose them. They're closer than your breath. In this culture, we tend to think, what you don't see doesn't exist. And so it's people tend to think, well, they're gone, we're done. Other cultures, this part of the grieving process is very important. And I found that the people who really integrate the grief into their lives and really come into a full healing have integrated this part, where they go into the sanctuary and maybe they talk to their loved one, or they write a letter to their loved one, or they just sit and just feel the presence of just being with that heart space, of feeling that connection with that loved one. A lot of exercises, wonderful exercises, because inevitably there's unfinished business, there's unresolved issues, and it's important to work through those. So I have, particularly in the Infinite Thread, a lot of different exercises for working with that and starting to heal. For example, a woman came to me who she'd been grieving for over 2 years. Her husband, who was the love of her life, had died in her arms, and he had died of a heart attack. She was holding him as the medics were running around, and she was trying to organize them, trying to save him, not realizing that he was dying. So she never said goodbye. And so when she came to me, she said, I cannot get past that. I never said goodbye, and this is like 2 years that she was kind of in this gray place, just wasn't healing. And so we worked with creating the sanctuary, and we worked with that ongoing relationship. And she created a sanctuary actually in her garage on a work table, where she would just look out the window, and every day she'd go and just sit, talk with her husband. And then we had a specific exercise where she saw herself that day that he died, holding her husband, and this time she turned toward him and said, goodbye, I love you. Something shifted. It was amazing to see. It was kind of like the grief just kind of opened up, and she started to, heal at a level that was that one stuck place that just had not really cracked. And with that experience, she said, oh my gosh, I feel like that is, that has really completed him. I've been able to say goodbye to him. He knows how much I love him, And that was amazing to see, that shift. I could tell you so many stories about, using the sanctuary for accessing that inner relationship. It's amazing. Parents who have lost their children and really feeling the presence of their children with them. That, we don't lose our loved ones. They're always here. And yet we kind of have this idea that they're gone forever and we can't see them. But you have to have the experience yourself. Me telling you that doesn't work. You have to go and have that experience for it to be part of your body, your experience. So then the final part of honoring grief involves the period of questioning that often happens out of grief. You begin to ask questions about your life. What's sacred to me? What's important? What do I need to do before I die? What really matters to me? Where am I going? What do I need, at this point in my life? What am I resisting? What's calling to me? Those kinds of questions that are difficult to ask because often they shape the foundation of your life. But it's actually where the creativity comes in the grief process. So I really encourage people, when those questions start to come, to sit in the sanctuary and just feel the questions. Not to come up with the answers. The answers will naturally come in and of themselves. But to ask the questions and to let those questions kind of stir things up. That actually, because you've gone through this loss, your life has changed. And you begin to rebuild your life based on asking yourself, what really matters to me? Grief changes your priorities. Everybody here who has gone through loss knows that. You know what's important, and you have to integrate that into every part of your life. So I wanted to read a little bit out of each of these parts, and then I'd love to open it up. I love questions and answers because it's interactive. So this is from part 1. We live by losing, leaving, and letting go. As with the seasons, we go through cycles of release and renewal. Each one of us will be called on at different times in our lives to face loss. Will we embrace it or shrink from it? Most of us naturally shrink from loss. We think that we can avoid loss if we keep busy or close our hearts a little to protect ourselves. Our losses accumulate, unfelt, unacknowledged, unresolved. Ungrieved losses take a toll on our hearts. We shut down from life, from one another, from ourselves. The grief remains buried in the psyche and body. It affects our relationships and compromises our aliveness. At some later time, sometime when we least expect, the grief erupts. Many of us have current problems rooted in the death or loss of a loved one that was never grieved. Almost all of us carry some degree of unresolved, unhealed grief that congests our hearts. Unresolved grief can show up in such symptoms as chronic physical ailments, fearfulness, depression, overworking, addiction, social isolation, and convulsive behavior. We pay a deep price for our unresolved grief. However, no matter how many years have passed, we can tap into a wise, intelligent force of healing that is available within each one of us. Okay, and now I'll go to, as we turn toward our grief, what would it be like to grieve without the old concepts and fears? As you enter into relationship with this wise healing force within you, what will you discover? Grief can surprise you with its power, its unpredictable timing, its fathomless depth, its transformational potential, and the scope of change it brings into your life. We discover that grief has its own nature, rhythm, and timing. It resists our attempts to control it. We also discover that grief involves more ongoing changes in our lives than we ever could imagine. It reaches into every part of our lives, our family, relationships, work, health, sleep, emotions, and sense of identity. No part of our lives is left untouched. So now if I go to the sanctuary part 2. It's a relief to try, not to try to be anyone else. Wait a minute, wait, I have to go back here. Yeah. The sanctuary invites us to be just as we are in our grief. This is its biggest gift. What healing is generated when life can flow through us without resistance? Usually we screen out what we don't want to see or feel in ourselves. However, whatever we repress robs us of energy and compromises our capacity for aliveness. What a shift it is to open to whatever is right here in our bodies, our feelings, our thoughts, and to turn toward whatever rises in our experience. It's a relief not to try to be anyone else or anywhere else, to allow ourselves to be exactly as we are without judging ourselves. When we are able to meet ourselves in this way, we naturally feel at home in ourselves. We rest in being, we relax, and begin to feel comfortable in our own skin. In the midst of our grieving, we feel present and whole, no longer divided. And then going to the last chapter. Lost by loss, we follow the trail back to ourselves. There we find that we are grieving for all the unlived moments for our unlived lives, for the times we've not been true to ourselves. Ultimately, that's the biggest grief we carry. For the ways we've compromised ourselves, for what we've sacrificed to be successful or to win the approval of others. Our grief wakes us up to life. We learn to bear the exquisite beauty and sorrow of being fully alive, to savor the simple moments, to cherish what's here now. If we can hold ourselves with compassion, we can hold others with compassion. If we can let ourselves be as we are, we can allow others to be as they are. We can begin to embrace life as it is in this moment and trust the flow of life as it unfolds. Then we learn to walk with the earth, on the earth with wonder. Grieving is sacred work. It has the power to take you deep into your source, where you will have a glimpse of your true home. That is where you find peace. So, I'd love if you have any questions. It's part of wonderful part of doing this interaction. Of course, we just kind of went deep. It's kind of hard to come back out. Yeah.
I just wanted to thank you. That was just beautiful. Everything you said touched me, and I've experienced it to be so true. I lost my mother, my father, my brother, my entire biologic family in a 3-year period recently, and my best friend. And I mean, I knew I would never ever be the same. My life changed forever. And just the way you put everything. I too have studied years ago with Stephen Levine. I'm in a similar profession. And God, he was just, his book, Who Dies, was the start of something, awesome. And I feel like your work is the continuation.
Thank you.
Yeah, everything is just, I'm fortunate. I found this grief group at the hospice, Portland Hospice, in Maryland, and honestly, it's saving my life and redefining me and actualizing me, and just wow.
Let me just say, when you go through multiple losses, though, because I have a client who lost her whole family in an airplane accident.
Yep.
And I got her like 15 years later. She was just, going into alcoholism and just falling apart. It's really important not to try to grieve all those losses all at once. Yes. So if you're doing the sanctuary, if you put one person's picture up and be with them as long as it takes to feel you've come to, some whole place,
Thank you. That's very
and then
good.
go to the next person as you start to feel the healing.
I'm doing that, and just naturally, like you
Yeah.
said, you know what to do.
Yes.
My body told me to do that.
Yes.
It's so funny, because I'm
Yeah.
going on to my brother now.
Yes.
Not because I wanted to.
Yeah. Well, when you go through that many losses in a short period of time, there tends to be so much overwhelm that you think of the whole group and then you just shut down.
Yeah.
So when you
Thank
just
you.
do one person at a time and you just kind of naturally go towards the one that just kind of naturally comes to the surface, and then the healing can just move like that.
Yeah, it does, and thank you. You put it
Yeah.
so eloquently. It's just so touching.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Can you expand upon the concept of grieving changes your priorities?
Grieving, yes. when you go through grief, your world kind of is, comes apart. It's kind of, I was just seeing this client that I saw today who just lost the love of her life. They were going to get married, and she lost him, and it was like she lost the dream of him as well as him and her whole future. And she said, I feel shattered. My whole life has just come apart. So, when you go through a major loss, you have to kind of rethink. I mean, it happens naturally, actually. What's important to you. You realize, what is the important part of, living. And so, just the loss of someone who's dear to you and going through that makes you question things. And that's where the creativity happens, is actually being willing to do that questioning, which most people avoid, It's very hard to question your life because sometimes it means choosing to quit a job or stop school or leave a partner or get together with a partner or, have a child, all kinds of things that, you start to see in a different perspective when you go through loss. It kind of, it opens up your eyes to things that you didn't realize, were as important as they are. And it kind of brings you down to that ground level of what really matters in life, which really comes down to our relationships and to love, and to connection, right? And also, to really follow your calling, not to put that away. Yeah.
I have a number of friends whose adult children are alive, but in very tragic or difficult circumstances, homeless, abusive relationships, and I think, I'm wondering if you could speak to the grief process for them when there's so much encouragement to let go, it's not your responsibility, but I see that these people are experiencing some of the health issues of not grieving.
Right. So, when you have children, you had dreams for your children, right? And then your children are not, kind of growing up along that line. So it is important to take the time to really feel where that grief is hitting you and to let go of your old images and your old concepts of what you thought should be for them, right? So, it's taking the time to turn toward that disappointment and that, the anger and the, just all the things that come up when you're disappointed with how, kind of your family is turning out, kind of in that way. So again, I think it would be taking, some time in a sanctuary, having a picture of your child, and then maybe even, taking the time to talk to your child where, you're not actually talking to them, but you're talking to, them within yourself. And really being able to express your, what you're feeling, your disappointment, something that, you wouldn't want to do right necessarily, right to them. But you need to be able to express that and not to kind of just let that ball up inside. So that there is some flow, in the relationship. The interesting thing that I've discovered in working with families where you have, some child that's, really having difficulties, particularly teenage years, and struggling. The best thing a parent can do is to really look to themselves and heal themselves. I remember a client that I worked with a couple of years ago, and she had, I think, 4 out of 5 children who were addicted. And she was not happy in her marriage. She was not really taking care of herself in that family. She started to do that, and it was amazing to watch the kids start to change, And she didn't do anything about saying, you have to go to a program. It's like she just started to turn toward herself and started to really look at, what do I need right now? And it was astounding because every single child is now in recovery. She's kind of going, whoa. I've tried all my life to get them on the right path, and all I did was really focus on, really bringing myself into a place of peace in myself. She left her husband. She kind of got a little place of her own. She'd wanted that forever, And, it's just like everything started to just kind of open up. So that's another piece, is, when people outside yourself are struggling, it's important to really keep coming back to yourself and checking in with, am I feeling whole? Am I taking care of myself? Am I living true to myself? Right? Yeah. Yeah.
I was reading a book recently on Theodore Roosevelt, and one thing that struck me about that was a man who encountered great grief when he was a young man, late 20s, career starting, and within a very short span of hours, he lost his wife and his mother. And
Yeah.
the grief was overwhelming, and he, in that old stiff upper lip time, he blocked everything out, never mentioned his wife again
Right.
throughout his entire lifetime. As his daughter, Alice, lived to 90, and the father never mentioned the word, so he completely blocked it off. And I assume he is poignant because he obviously struggled with a great, and yet we talk about creativity blocks, he took a manic sort of, he had to stay in perpetual moto not to feel the grief, and though he probably suffered, he was one of our greatest presidents, first-rate environmentalist, performer, on and on. And it was an ironic thing there where one man, however he may have suffered, did not become blocked. He actually became one of our great progressive leaders.
Yeah, he turned that into, kind of a, performing, doing,
Yes.
creating. Yeah. The interesting thing about that I've noticed, when I wrote Losing a Parent, I got a letter from a woman, and she said that she was, I think at that point in her early 30s, and she wrote me because she said that she was working into high tech, and she said that she had come to a point in her life where a number of things had happened. Her mentor had died, her boss was giving her trouble, she was going through a number of kinds of things. And all of a sudden, she completely fell apart. She started having heart, murmurs. She had headaches. She went to the hospital. They checked her over, nothing wrong. And there was a social worker there who kind of took her history and put two and two together and said, "When did your father die?" And she said, "Oh, back when I was 12." And she said, "Did you ever grieve that?" She said, "No." And so she said, the social worker said, "I think, that may be something for you to kind of turn." She started looking at her life. Every choice she had made involved trying to, she said she married a robotic type man who couldn't feel. She was always busy. She was the class clown so that she could laugh at things and didn't have to really deal with the serious nature. And she started grieving, and all of those physical symptoms stopped. So what will happen is that grief literally goes into the body, it gets buried, and it waits for the right time to come out.
Wow.
And sometimes it's kind of like what I said in here, it's when you least expect it. Suddenly, it comes through the physical breakdown, or it comes through a crisis, and it's like suddenly it's there. I think there's an author, William Steinem, I'm not thinking of, but he said that he went into a depression when he was writing, I think his fourth.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. And he went into his depression when he was writing one of his books. Went to bed, he couldn't get out of bed. And as he was going through that process, he realized, oh my gosh, I never grieved the death of my mother when I was 11, 12. And he started to grieve that. At some point, those losses do turn up. And he, Roosevelt was able to kind of get through that. It probably compromised a lot of his aliveness in other areas, but he was able to channel that, and that was his coping mechanism for being able to stay away from the grief. And it was a time when there was that stiff upper lip, and you just don't talk about it. Yeah. Thank you. That's a great story. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
Yes, my question is, which other countries, you mentioned before, other cultures attend to grieving very differently? Which other countries have you studied in? How do you compare? Since I've been losing over 40 of my close friends and elders in the Western culture, whereas in the Asian countries where I spent a third of my life.
Right.
There's this very colorfully celebrated.
Yes, right. And that's really true, for the Hispanic cultures, when you have the celebration, you go into the grave, the sites. It's fascinating with the Japanese culture. There was an article in the New York Times, I think probably about 10 years ago, and it said that in Japan, grief doesn't sever family ties. And they talk about in this article how this woman in this village had lost her husband, and there was an altar. When you walked in the front door, there was an altar, and the first person you would talk to would be the person who had died, and you would say, "Hello, Mr. So-and-so, it's beautiful outside," and you would have a conversation. She said that her relationship had become much more tender with her husband since he had died. And he used to yell at her a lot, and now there was just this tenderness, and she just integrated that relationship in. It was a part of her life. But those altars are very common, say, in Japanese culture. That that's unnatural. It's the ancestors. Acknowledging the ancestors. And I wish that we did something, organically like that. Just kind of acknowledging. The Day of the Dead is a wonderful celebration of, bringing forth the ancestors, having these colorful altars, all the pictures, and really acknowledging that we carry all of these people within us.
So how do you bring that Asian wisdom into your teaching and
Well, creating the sanctuary with an altar is part of that, right? It's kind of like you have a place that you go and that you sit and you allow your relationship to be there with that person who has died. And very similar, it's like you may not have it out in your living room, you may have it in your bedroom, or you may have it in a separate room. But that you're sitting in relationship with that person. Part of it is when someone dies. Again, the person I was working with today, her lover died very suddenly and completely out of the blue, and she cannot believe that he's dead. And so we talked about, I often have clients who will come in and they'll say, well, it's come down here, and now it's come down this far, and now it's come down this far. And there's kind of this process of letting that loss in so that it begins to kind of be embodied. And the altar, when you create an altar, there's the picture there, is a way of every time you go in there, you sit and you see that picture and you're there because you've lost them, so that there's that sense of being able to come into relationship with them and to say, they have died and I am here because I'm grieving. And that allows for that, that grief to begin to kind of drop down, into, again, grief is all about being in your body. It's not about being in your head. Your grief will never heal up here. You can't think yourself through grief. It's going to come from down here. So it's letting that grief drop down. Yeah.
I wanted to go back to multiple losses and the strategy around that, because for me, I lost both my parents last year within a 7-month period, and I was in caretaking situations for both of them, and it's like every day they're both there, and I can't pick one over the other. I can't just block one out and just focus on another, right? And because they were divorced for so long, I have very different relationships with both of them, with their own different levels of complexity, right?
Well,
and
somehow you're gonna,
So
a kid
overwhelming.
if you don't think of it as choosing one over the other, but just having one to focus on, and maybe have a hat where you have the 2 pieces of paper and you pick one so that you don't feel the weight that you've chosen one over the other, But you're gonna have to deal with them one at a time, because the relationships are complex and they are different. And you're not gonna be able, it'll be a jumble if you try to do it all together, because you've got them with your separate relationship, then you've got the divorce, and all of that rolling around. You need to deal with each one and the unresolved things with each one in that particular relationship. So find a way that you can kind of focus on one without feeling the guilt. It doesn't matter which one goes first, because sometimes it's the easier one goes first and the harder one is later. It isn't necessarily the first one is the one that you're the most close with, right? But find a way that you can do that focusing without judging yourself for who is showing up first. Or you might start with, say, your mother, And then feel like this isn't working, I want to go to my father. So then take your mother's picture down, put your father, and you'll get the, you know, the impulse from inside. Another way to look at that is, you know, look at your dreams. I don't know if you're dreaming about one or the other more. Which are you dreaming about more?
Well, right now it's my mom because she's the freshest.
Right.
She's the one that just most recently died. Before it was my dad.
Right.
And now that's.
So maybe you want to start with your mother. If that's coming up in your dreams, very often the dreams are giving you clues. I remember a client I saw a couple weeks ago who came in and, oh my gosh, the level of losses. I mean, she had gone through adopting and losing the child and, you know, losing other kids in her, you know, dying and divorces. I mean, it was, her sister-in-law was murdered. I mean, it was just like this huge array of losses. And I said to her, I'm not going to guess where to, you know, go in here. Let's wait for a dream. And sure enough, you know, a dream came the next week, and that's where we entered in. Because the information is coming from within you. It's not coming from outside. You will be guided from inside as to where you are directing, you know, your energy. And you'll get to both of them. You know, and each one will be entirely different in terms of your relationship with them, what, you know, what unfolds with them. So don't worry about, you know, well, I'm with my mom first, you know. You'll find so much richness in focusing on one and then the other.
And I wanted to ask you about the concept of like loss can create more loss, right? Because of my
Yes.
losses,
Yes.
things are so different for me.
Right.
And I've realized that there's certain things and people that aren't healthy for me anymore.
Yes.
Right?
Exactly.
And so now I have more loss because
Yes.
I'm trying to self-love and
Yes.
protect myself and remove things that are no longer healthy for me.
There's so many layers to loss. And you start to drill down, you start to realize, there's a wonderful saying, grief rewrites your address book. You know? I mean, it's like people who are uncomfortable with your grief will back away, people you thought you could count on, other people will show up who didn't even think that you were connected to. So there's that loss. People often come in and say, I'm so sad because my best friend can't even be there for me right now. And that's a loss. So yes, and that's so showing up in the sanctuary, it's acknowledging those losses, you know, because they do show up, and there are all those different layers. Your world is changing, and in that there's loss. Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting, the conversation in dealing with the loss of life, which has this inevitable consequence, and I think you've been terrific in describing ways to deal with that. When, on the other hand, you have a fresh loss of a relationship, not a loss of life, but you have a sense of guilt and you have a sense of wonderment, where are you going to go from here, or even the big waves of emotions.
Same thing, yeah.
How do you transform that through this sanctuary consequence without feeling there's some control that you have that maybe you'll restore this relationship?
Well, so, you know, again, if you took 10 minutes a day to just go and sit with that grief as it's working on you, not to restore the relationship, but just to feel the loss of it and the depth of that loss. And to come into relationship with that, of really feeling that letting go. Because, I mean, even if you were to restore it, it would be different from here on, right? I mean, it's already changed. You've already lost what you have. But, you know, take the time to just show up for yourself, you know, and you know, maybe have her picture, you know, up there that you're, you know, kind of relating, and feeling that, or maybe talking, not a conversation that would be with that person, but, you know, just kind of what you need to say, what you need to resolve, right? So you use that time for the interior stuff that's happening in you, apart from anything that's happening with that person.
So sort of encapsulate,
Yes.
you're working on me rather than we.
Yes, right. And that's part of, when you're going through a breakup in a relationship, there's that energy that's gotten, kind of that, they have, it's like you've become, there's an energy that's with each other, the we. You've got to pull that back and come back to the you. And so there's a lot of pain in doing that, but there's also, a lot of fulfillment of realizing, oh, here I am. So, part of the sanctuary is like, here I am. And I'm enough. Right? Yeah. So, I wanted to just, should I take one more question? Or? Okay.
I've got a question.
Oh.
What do you do with a culture that really doesn't want you to grieve, that wants you and expects you to move on, and if you grieve, they think you're a whiner?
Well, part of that is just to speak directly to the people. If you have friends who are saying, come on, it's been 6 weeks, get on with your life, to say, that doesn't work for me. Speak up to it and challenge, kind of that pressure that we're supposed to get over the grief quickly, and that it's by turning away and just kind of forgetting about it is going to heal it. So I think it's really challenging the places that that's showing up. And if it's in, kind of friends or, people you work with who are, saying, come on, get on with it, to say, hey, that's not my truth. I'm still grieving. You need to know that. And let that be as it is. So, speaking up for yourself and understanding that we just know that people are not going to show up for us in the way that we really want to be supported for the most part. And there's a grief in that as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was curious, what, if anything, can be done before maybe the person dies that can either accelerate or attenuate the grieving process?
Well, there's a grief called anticipatory grieving. And we really start grieving, when somebody's sick and you know that you're in a process of dying. You're already going through that grieving process. And doesn't mean that when you actually get to the death, you're not going to feel. You can't just do all your grieving ahead of time and then they die and you're fine. Something happens when you get to that point, that person dies and you realize how final it is. There's a kind of another hit that happens. Like I did a lot of anticipatory grieving for my father, but when he actually died, it was like, boom, it's just like it hits you hard because there's this kind of organic thing that just kind of happens. So I think it's really important to deal with that anticipatory grief because that means that in relationship to that person who's dying, you can show up and be present much more, right? Because you're not avoiding that you are in a process of letting go and you are in a process of, losing that person. So it's letting that, kind of unfold. And then, the death itself is, it has a huge impact. And then the grief can move from there. But the anticipatory grieving it can help some because you're already learning. Part of it is if you start to get confidence that you can grieve without feeling overwhelmed, then it's kind of like you start to have that, it's like you would accept that life is going to have these losses and that you can actually move through that. So it's getting confidence in your grieving, and anticipatory grieving can actually give you more confidence.
What's the best thing, or is there anything that you can do for somebody who's really grieving who you want to help?
Someone who's what?
Grieving who you want to help. Like when your best friend's going through.
Okay, that's a good question. Because I just had a grief retreat a couple weeks ago, and there were 14 of us, and we talked about that. The best thing that you can give someone is not to give advice, not to try to change them, just to be with them. To say, hey, I'm here for you. I know that you're grieving, and however I can be, sometimes they may want to talk, sometimes they may want to be silent. But to just be with them, to hold the space. Because as we, in this grief retreat, as we went around the circle, different. You know, someone had lost her mother just recently, another one had lost a 16-year-old child to suicide. I mean, it was a lot of loss. And there was a tendency, you know, since like the man talking about his son dying, and he's full of emotion, and it's like the people around him are wanting to, you know, it's okay, it's okay. And I said, you know, just let him be in his own space. Let him know that we're holding the space for him. This is a sacred space. We don't have to rush him. We don't have to, you know, make him come out of the feeling. You don't want to jam a Kleenex box in their face, you know? Just kind of let the emotion, let him be in that. That is enough. That's a gift that the culture does not give. You know? Just holding the space for someone who's grieving. That's the best gift.
Okay, last question.
Yeah.
What about a friend who isn't grieving and you know they should be? Like, she lost her mother and she was very close to her mother and it's just sailing over her head. Can you give them a book? Your book?
You could. I mean,
I don't want to infringe on her space, but I know.
It would not overwhelm her, and she could tap into it wherever, you know, she wants to tap in. The thing you have to understand is even in families, you know, let's say a parent dies and you've got siblings, those siblings are going to grieve in a very different way.
Right.
Some of them get right into it, some of them takes a year to get into it, you know. There's no judgment about, you know.
I'm not judging her,
Yeah.
but it's been 3 years.
Right. Well, so just to say, you know, I just want you to know, you know, like even to say to her, look, I just went to, you know, a talk and a book signing about grief, and I'd love to share some of it with you if you're interested.
Okay.
You know, and here's a book, if you know, and take with it what you want, because if you just kind of hold the space that, you know, you understand that she's grieving at some, you know, deep level that she's maybe, you know, trying to avoid. But just to say, you know, I am here for you when it comes up, you know, I'm here.
Okay.
But you can't, you know, push somebody
No.
into the grieving process.
Right.
And sometimes it takes a crisis to get to that point. Sometimes, you know, a number of things will happen and they'll suddenly tap into it.
All right.
It's frustrating, but you know, it's kind of, everybody has their own timing.
Right.
So it's really having compassion, you know, for people grieve differently. Nobody grieves just the same.
Right.
And they have a different timetable often.
Okay. Thank you.
So, and then I have a website with a lot of articles. I just had an article published by the Monterey Herald on healing a broken heart, which might be interesting for you. There's suggestions on the website. You can reach me through the website. I have a sheet up here for different resources if you want to, you know, kind of access different resources. I'll be coming up to do a keynote at a conscious grieving retreat in Marin. There's the sheets about that. And then for women, I have a yearly retreat in Hawaii where we go and spend 5 days in silence, just being with nature and really going deep, and swimming with the dolphins, which come into this little bay where we are. It's a completely, it's outside, and we have just a few places left in that. But anything else am I not thinking of? I have my other books here. And
say the name of your website.
World Wide Web, alexandrakennedy.com. Here's cards, and that's on here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And I'm, you know, certainly.